The sweat dripped down Zelda Lambert's face as she bent low over the wheat field, her back screaming in protest, and she wondered if this harvest would be the one that finally broke her. The summer of 1883 had been merciless in eastern Washington Territory, and the land around Spokane Falls seemed determined to test every ounce of strength she possessed. Her father had been dead for 3 months now, and the creditors were circling like vultures, waiting for her to fail so they could claim the 200 acres that had been in her family since they had arrived from Missouri in 1871. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her sun-browned skin. 22 years old and alone except for her younger brother Samuel, who was only 14 and doing his best to help, but was still too young to handle the heavy labor that harvest demanded. They had hired hands before, but after her father's death, there was no money left to pay workers. Everything had gone to settling debts and buying seed for this crop. This harvest was everything. If they could bring it in and sell it, they could hold onto the land. If they failed, they would lose it all. The wheat stretched out before her in golden waves, beautiful and mocking in equal measure. She had maybe 2 weeks before it would be overripe and begin to fall, losing value with each passing day. Her scythe felt like it weighed 100 pounds as she swung it through the stalks, her shoulders burning with each stroke. Samuel worked 50 yards away, his smaller frame bent over his own section, and she could see even from this distance that he was struggling just as much as she was. They would never make it in time. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. Even working from sunup to sundown, even pushing themselves until they collapsed each night, they could not possibly harvest 200 acres alone. The land would be taken, sold at auction, and she and Samuel would be left with nothing. All her father's work, all the years of breaking this ground and building their home would be lost. Zelda heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up, squinting against the bright August sun. A rider was approaching from the direction of the mountains to the east, leading a pack mule behind him. She straightened slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle she kept propped against the fence post 20 feet away. A woman alone had to be careful, especially these days when word had gotten around that she had no man to protect her. The rider came closer, and she could make out more details. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing dusty leather and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, and he rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. As he approached, he raised one hand in greeting, showing he meant no harm. "Afternoon," he called out when he was close enough. His voice was deep and steady, with a slight drawl that suggested he had spent time in the Southern Territories. "Name is Thomas Walker. I am looking for work and saw you out here. Wondered if you might be hiring for the harvest." Zelda studied him carefully as he pulled his horse to a stop. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than herself, maybe 25 or 26. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with strong features and eyes that were a startling shade of gray. There was something open and honest in his expression that put her slightly at ease, though she remained cautious. "I am not hiring," she said, proud that her voice came out steady despite her exhaustion. "I've got no money to pay workers." Thomas looked out over the fields, then back at her. "Looks like you have got a lot of wheat that needs bringing in." "That is my concern, not yours." She did not mean to sound harsh, but she was too tired to be polite. He nodded slowly, seeming to consider something. "I have been up in the mountains trapping all winter and spring. Made good money on furs, so I do not need wages. But I could use a place to stay for a few weeks before I head south. If you have got a barn or outbuilding where I could sleep and maybe share your meals, I would be willing to help bring in your harvest." Zelda stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to work for just food and shelter?" "That is what I said." He dismounted in one smooth motion, and she realized he was even taller than she had thought, easily over 6 feet. "I am a hard worker, and I know my way around a harvest. Grew up on a farm in Tennessee before I came west." She wanted to accept immediately, wanted to grab this lifeline he was offering, but years of her father's caution made her hesitate. "Why would you do that? What are you really after?" Something flickered in his gray eyes. "Respect, maybe." "I am after exactly what I said. A place to rest for a few weeks and some decent food. The mountains are lonely, and I have been eating my own cooking for too long. Plus, I do not like seeing good wheat go to waste, and I do not like seeing people struggle when I could help." He paused. "But if you would rather I move on, I will. No offense taken." Zelda looked over at Samuel, who had stopped working and was watching the exchange with wide eyes. She looked back at the endless fields of wheat, at the impossible task before them. She looked at Thomas Walker, this stranger who had appeared as if in answer to a prayer she had been too proud to speak aloud. "There is a bunkhouse behind the main barn," she said finally. "It is not fancy, but it is clean and dry. We eat simple, but there is plenty. If you are serious about helping, I will not turn you away." A smile crossed his face, transforming his serious expression into something warm and genuine. "I am serious. Let me get my horse and mule settled, and I will be ready to work." "Wait," she said as he started to turn away. "You said your name is Thomas Walker." "That is right." "I am Zelda Lambert. That is my brother Samuel." She gestured toward the boy, who had started walking over to join them. "This is our land, and I am in charge here. If you work for me, you follow my instructions. Is that clear?" The smile stayed on Thomas's face. "Crystal clear, Miss Lambert." Samuel reached them, breathless and curious. "Are you really going to help us?" "I am," Thomas said, extending his hand to the boy. "Thomas Walker, pleased to meet you." Samuel shook his hand eagerly. "Samuel Lambert." "We sure could use the help, mister. There is so much wheat, and it is just the two of us since Pa died." "Samuel," Zelda said sharply, uncomfortable with sharing family troubles with a stranger, but Thomas just nodded. "I am sorry for your loss. Losing a father is hard." "I lost mine when I was about your age." Something in the way he said it, simple and sincere, made Zelda's throat tighten. She pushed the emotion away and picked up her scythe. "The bunkhouse is that way. There is a water pump by the barn for you and your animals. We eat supper at sundown." Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you, Miss Lambert. I will be back out to help within the hour." She watched him lead his horse and mule toward the barn, then turned back to her work. She did not let herself hope too much. He might work for a day or two and then decide it was too hard, might take off in the night. But even a day or two of help was more than she had before he arrived. True to his word, Thomas returned in less than an hour. He had changed into work clothes and carried a scythe that looked well used and well maintained. Without any fuss, he moved to a section of uncut wheat and began to work. Zelda tried not to watch him, tried to focus on her own section, but she could not help noticing the efficient, powerful strokes of his blade, the steady rhythm he maintained. He worked like someone who had done this many times before, someone who knew how to pace himself for the long haul. By the time the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they had cut more wheat than Zelda and Samuel had managed in the previous 2 days combined. Her body ached in ways that were familiar now, but there was also a tiny spark of hope beginning to glow in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could actually do this. She called an end to the work as the light began to fade. Samuel practically collapsed where he stood, and even Thomas looked tired as he leaned on his scythe. But when their eyes met across the field, he smiled at her, and she found herself almost smiling back. "We have got a good start," he said as they walked together toward the house. "If we can keep this pace, we will have it all cut in 10 days, maybe less. Then we have to bundle it and get it to the granary in town," Zelda said, not wanting to get too hopeful, "one step at a time." His voice was calm, reassuring. "We will get it done." At the house, a simple 2-room cabin with a sleeping loft where Samuel slept, Zelda set about preparing supper while the men washed up at the pump outside. She had a pot of beans that had been simmering all day, and she made cornbread in her mother's old iron skillet. It was humble fare, but it was hot and filling. Thomas ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that seemed genuine rather than flattering. Samuel peppered him with questions about life in the mountains, about trapping and hunting, and Thomas answered patiently, telling stories that made the boy's eyes light up with wonder. Zelda listened while she cleaned up, fascinated despite herself. Thomas had been all over the Western Territories, from the pueblos of New Mexico to the gold camps of Montana. He had trapped beaver and hunted elk, had survived blizzards and close calls with bears. He spoke matter-of-factly about hardships that would have killed lesser men, and with real affection about the beauty of wild places. "Why did you come down from the mountains now?" Samuel asked. "Could you not trap in the summer? Summer furs are not worth much," Thomas explained. "Most trappers either find work in town or move around until fall. I have been thinking about heading down to California, maybe seeing the ocean, so I am making my way south slowly." "Have you got family anywhere?" The question came out before Zelda could stop herself. Thomas shook his head. "Not anymore. Ma died when I was young, Pa when I was 15. I had a sister, but she married a shopkeeper in St. Louis, and that is not the kind of life I am suited for. We write when we can, but we are not close." "So you just wander?" Zelda tried to imagine a life with no roots, no home place. "I guess I do." He met her eyes across the table. "Some people are meant to stay in one place and build something. Others are meant to keep moving. I have always been the moving kind." She felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at that, which made no sense. She had just met this man. What did it matter to her if he was the wandering type? After supper, Thomas thanked her for the meal and headed to the bunkhouse. Samuel climbed up to his loft, asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. Zelda sat alone by the small fire, mending a tear in one of Samuel's shirts and thinking about the day. Thomas Walker was a puzzle. He was clearly capable and intelligent, yet he lived like a vagabond. He had helped them without hesitation, asking for almost nothing in return, yet he did not seem like the type to be taken advantage of. There was a quiet strength about him, a self-sufficiency that she recognized, because she had worked hard to develop it in herself. She found herself wondering what it would be like to live the way he did, answerable to no one, free to go wherever the mood struck. Then she looked around the cabin her father had built with his own hands, at the land that had been her whole world for most of her life, and knew she could never leave it. This was where she belonged. This was worth fighting for. The next morning, Thomas was already at work when Zelda came out at first light. She had brought him coffee and cornbread left from the night before, and he accepted them gratefully. "You did not have to start without me," she said. "Wanted to get an early jump on the day. The heat will be brutal by noon." They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Up before dawn, working through the morning until the sun was directly overhead and it became dangerous to push themselves in the heat. A break for the midday meal and rest in the shade, then back to work until dusk. The wheat fell before their scythes in steady swaths, and slowly but surely, the cut portion of the fields grew larger. Thomas was as good as his word, a tireless worker who never complained and never shirked. But it was more than his labor that Zelda found herself appreciating. He had a quiet way of teaching Samuel things, showing the boy how to sharpen a blade properly or how to tie bundles that would not come loose. He fixed the door on the chicken coop that had been hanging crooked for months, and repaired a weak board in the barn wall that Zelda had been meaning to get to but never had time for. In the evenings, after supper, he would sometimes take out a harmonica and play old songs that reminded Zelda of her childhood, when her mother was still alive, and her father would sing while they sat around the fire. Samuel loved those evenings, and Zelda had to admit she did too. The music filled the empty spaces in the house, made it feel less lonely. She caught herself watching Thomas more than she should. The way he moved, economical and sure. The way his face looked when he listened to Samuel's endless questions, patient and kind. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which he did more often as the days passed, and he seemed to relax around them. It had been so long since there had been a man around the place, someone strong and capable who could shoulder the burdens that felt too heavy for her alone. She had to remind herself constantly that this was temporary. Thomas had been clear about that. He was helping them harvest, then he would move on. She could not let herself get attached. She could not let Samuel get too attached either, though she feared that ship had already sailed. One afternoon, about a week after Thomas had arrived, Zelda was working on bundling cut wheat when she heard angry voices. She looked up to see 3 men on horseback approaching from the direction of the road. Her stomach sank as she recognized the lead rider, Cyrus Hendricks, the banker from Spokane Falls who held the note on her property. Thomas had stopped working too, his hand resting casually on the handle of his scythe, his body positioned between the riders and where Samuel worked further down the field. Zelda appreciated the protective instinct even as she knew this was her problem to handle. She walked forward to meet the riders, keeping her chin up and her expression neutral. "Mr. Hendricks, what brings you out here?" Hendricks was a portly man in his 50s, with a florid face and an air of self-importance. He looked down at her from his horse with barely concealed contempt. "Miss Lambert, I came to see how your harvest is progressing. The payment on your note is due in 3 weeks. I am aware of that." She kept her voice level. "As you can see, we are bringing in the wheat. I will have your payment on time. That remains to be seen." He looked around the property with a critical eye. "Your father was a good man, but he was not much of a businessman. He borrowed more than he could afford, and now that debt falls to you. I would be within my rights to foreclose right now, you know. The note allows for it when the primary borrower dies. The note also allows for the debt to pass to heirs," Zelda said, fighting to keep the anger out of her voice. "My lawyer confirmed that." "Lawyer," Hendricks snorted. "You mean that drunk Thompson?" He could barely read the contract, let alone interpret it properly. Thomas had moved closer, and now he spoke up. "The lady said she will have your payment on time. Seems like that should be enough." Hendricks turned his cold gaze on Thomas. "And who might you be?" "Thomas Walker. I am helping with the harvest." "Helping? With what money is she paying you? She should be saving every penny for what she owes the bank." "My arrangement with Miss Lambert is none of your concern," Thomas said quietly, but there was steel underneath the polite words. "Everything about this property is my concern until that note is satisfied." Hendricks looked back at Zelda. "I will be back in 3 weeks for my payment. If you do not have it, all of this becomes property of the bank. And I already have buyers interested, buyers who will pay cash." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his 2 companions following. Zelda watched them go, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She hated feeling powerless, hated even more that Hendricks had witnessed it. "That man is a vulture," Thomas said flatly. "That man holds the deed to everything I own." Zelda's voice came out more bitter than she intended. And he is right. My father borrowed too much trying to expand the farm. He thought he could pay it back after a few good harvests, but then his health started failing. She looked out over the fields. I have to get this wheat to market and pray the price is good enough to satisfy the debt. We will get it done, Thomas said with quiet confidence. And the price will be good. It is quality wheat, Zelda. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss before it, and the sound of it in his deep voice did strange things to her heartbeat. She looked up at him and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up for me and for everything else. You do not need to thank me." He smiled, and there was a warmth in it that made her feel like maybe she was not facing everything alone anymore. "Come on, we have got wheat to cut." They worked even harder after that visit, driven by the looming deadline. Samuel complained less about his aching muscles, and Zelda pushed herself past the point of exhaustion every day. Thomas kept pace with them, and whenever she faltered, whenever doubt crept in, he was there with a steady word or a confident smile that somehow made her believe they could actually do this. The evenings became her favorite time. They were all too tired for much talk, but there was a companionship in the silence, a sense of being united in common purpose. Sometimes Thomas would tell stories of his travels, and Zelda found herself fascinated by the world beyond her farm. Sometimes Samuel would practice the harmonica Thomas was teaching him to play, producing sounds that were more noise than music but improving each day. And sometimes they would just sit and watch the sun set over the wheat fields, painting everything gold and amber. One such evening, after Samuel had gone to bed, Zelda and Thomas sat outside on the porch steps. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky in glittering profusion. "I have been meaning to ask you something," Zelda said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Ask away." "Why did you really stop here? There must be dozens of farms around Spokane Falls. Why ours?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and she thought maybe he would not answer. Then he said, "I saw you out in that field, working yourself to the bone, and I saw your brother trying so hard to keep up. I could see you were in trouble, and I could see you were not the kind to give up. It reminded me of my mother after my father died. She worked herself to death trying to keep our farm going, too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit she could not do it alone." He looked at her, his gray eyes dark in the starlight. "I was too young to help her much. I have always wished I could have done more. Maybe helping you is a way of making up for that." Zelda felt tears prick her eyes. "I am sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago." He was quiet again, then added, "But you are not like her in one important way. You are going to succeed. You are going to save this farm. You sound very certain." "I am certain. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met, Zelda Lambert. And you are smart enough to accept help when you need it. That is not weakness. That is wisdom." No one had ever spoken to her like that before, with such complete confidence in her abilities. Her father had loved her, she knew, but he had always treated her as someone who needed protecting, someone who could not quite handle the harsh realities of frontier life. Thomas spoke to her as an equal, as someone capable and strong. "Can I tell you something?" she said impulsively. "Of course." "I am scared. Not just about the harvest, though that terrifies me too. I am scared about what comes after. Even if we save the farm this time, what about next year? What about all the years after that? How am I supposed to work 200 acres with just me and a 14-year-old boy? You will find a way. Maybe you hire help when you can afford it. Maybe you lease some of the land to sharecroppers. Maybe you sell off a portion and focus on keeping the rest productive." He paused. "Or maybe you find a partner, someone to share the load." Her heart skipped. "You mean get married?" That is one option. She laughed, but it came out harsh. Who would want to marry me? I've got nothing but debt and hard work to offer. You are wrong about that. His voice was soft but firm. You have got courage and loyalty and strength. You have got a good heart and a sharp mind. Any man would be lucky to have you. Zelda turned to look at him and found his eyes already on her. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something she could not name but could definitely feel. She became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the breadth of his shoulders and the planes of his face. "Thomas," she started to say, but did not know how to finish. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were calloused and warm, and the touch sent a shiver down her spine. "You are remarkable, Zelda Lambert," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." Then he stood, breaking the moment. "I should let you get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be another long day." She watched him walk to the bunkhouse, her heart pounding. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible line had been crossed. She did not know what it meant or where it might lead, but she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Walker had become more to her than just a hired hand. Much more. The next week passed in a blur of hard work and growing awareness. Every accidental touch seemed to linger. Every shared glance felt weighted with meaning. Zelda caught herself thinking about Thomas at odd moments, wondering what he was thinking, whether he felt the same strange pull she did. She told herself she was being foolish. He was leaving as soon as the harvest was done. He had said as much. He was not the settling kind, and even if he was, why would he want to tie himself to a struggling farm and a woman with more debts than prospects? But then she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, or he would find an excuse to stand close to her, and the hope would flare up again despite her best efforts to contain it. Samuel noticed too. "You like him," the boy said one evening when they were alone. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Yes, you do. You like Thomas, and I think he likes you too." "Samuel," she said warningly. "I am not a kid, Zelda. I can see how you look at each other." He grinned. "I think it would be good if he stayed. I like having him around. And we could use a man on the farm permanent-like." "He is not staying. He is going to California, remember." "Maybe he would change his mind if you asked him to." "I am not going to ask him to do any such thing." She tried to sound firm. "Now go fetch water for the morning." But Samuel's words stayed with her. Would Thomas stay if she asked? Did she even have the courage to ask? And if he did stay, would it be for the farm or for her? 3 days before the payment was due to the bank, they cut the last of the wheat. Zelda stood in the middle of the field, surrounded by bundles ready to be loaded and taken to the granary, and let herself feel a moment of pure triumph. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought in the entire harvest. Thomas came up beside her, wiping sweat from his face. "We make a good team." "We do," she agreed, and meant it in more ways than one. The next 2 days were a frenzy of loading wagons and hauling wheat to the granary in Spokane Falls. The grain buyer examined the wheat carefully, running it through his fingers and checking for moisture and quality. Finally, he named a price that made Zelda's knees weak with relief. It was enough. It was more than enough. She would be able to pay Hendricks with money left over to see them through the winter. That evening, she paid a visit to the bank. Hendricks looked surprised to see her walk through the door, and even more surprised when she counted out the full payment in cash on his desk. "This satisfies the note," she said, watching him count it with barely concealed disappointment. "So it does." He made out a receipt with obvious reluctance. "I will not lie, Miss Lambert, I did not think you would manage it. I had help." She took the receipt and folded it carefully. "Good day, Mr. Hendricks." She walked out of that bank feeling like she was floating. The farm was safe. They had made it through. She climbed onto the wagon where Thomas waited and could not contain her smile. "It is done. We are free and clear." His grin was wide and genuine. "I knew you would do it." They rode back to the farm in high spirits, making plans for the winter, for next year's planting. But as they pulled up to the barn and Thomas began unhitching the horses, reality came crashing back down on Zelda. This was done. The harvest was over. Thomas had kept his end of the bargain, had given them weeks of back-breaking labor in exchange for nothing but food and shelter. Now he was free to leave, to continue his journey south to California and the ocean he wanted to see. She should thank him and let him go. That was the right thing to do, the sensible thing. But the thought of watching him ride away, of never seeing his face again or hearing his laugh or feeling that spark when their eyes met, was almost physically painful. "Thomas," she said as he was leading the horses to their stalls. He turned. "Yes," the words stuck in her throat. "How did you ask someone to completely upend their life? How did you tell someone you had known less than a month that you could not imagine your future without them in it? I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. We could not have done this without you." Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment maybe. "You are welcome. It was my pleasure to help." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, and then Samuel burst out of the house, breaking the tension. "We should celebrate," the boy announced. "We saved the farm." "Zelda, can we have a special supper, please?" She forced a smile. "I suppose we can. Let me see what we have." That night she made the best meal she could manage with their limited supplies. Fried chicken from one of their hens, potatoes with gravy, biscuits with the last of their honey, and a dried apple pie. It was more food than they usually had at once, and it felt festive and special. Samuel chattered happily throughout the meal, making plans for next year, talking about how they could build their herd and maybe get some pigs. Thomas responded when spoken to, but Zelda noticed he was quieter than usual, almost subdued. After supper, Samuel went out to check on the animals one last time before bed. Thomas helped Zelda clean up, the two of them working in silence. Finally, as she was drying the last plate, he spoke. "I will be leaving tomorrow." The plate nearly slipped from her hands. "Tomorrow, so soon?" "The harvest is done. You do not need me anymore." "That is not true." The words came out more vehement than she intended. He turned to face her fully. "What do you mean?" This was it. This was her moment to speak or forever wonder what might have been. Zelda set the plate down and forced herself to meet his eyes. "I mean that I do not want you to go. I know you are headed to California. I know you are not the settling kind. But these past few weeks, having you here, it has been the happiest I have been since before my father got sick. And I do not think it is just because you helped with the harvest." Thomas was very still, watching her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Zelda," he said, and there was something raw in his voice. "You know what you are saying." "I am saying I have feelings for you. I am saying that I am asking you to stay, not as a hired hand but as someone who belongs here, with me, with us." Her hands were shaking, but she pressed on. "I know it is crazy. I know we have only known each other a few weeks. But I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and if there is any chance you might feel the same way, I had to tell you before you left." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Thomas stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Zelda felt her heart sinking. She had miscalculated. She had made a fool of herself. He was going to let her down gently and leave, and she would have to live with the mortification forever. Then he crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and cupped her face in his hands. "I was planning to leave tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "because I was afraid if I stayed any longer, I would not be able to leave at all. I have been falling for you since the first day I saw you in that field, so fierce and determined and strong. Every day since has just made it worse, or better. I do not even know any more. Then why were you leaving? Her voice was barely a whisper. Because I did not think someone like you could want someone like me. I have got nothing to offer, Zelda. No land, no money, no prospects. Just the clothes on my back and a horse and mule. What kind of future is that? It is enough, she said firmly. More than enough. I do not need money or prospects. I have got land. What I need is a partner, someone to share the work and share my life. Someone who sees me as an equal, not as someone who needs taking care of. You are that person, Thomas. He searched her face, and whatever he found there seemed to convince him. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, a question being asked. Zelda answered by pressing closer, her hands fisting in his shirt. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and hungry, weeks of pent-up longing pouring out all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure about this? Once I stay, I am staying. I am not a man who does things halfway. I am sure. Are you? I have never been more sure of anything in my life. He kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter. I love you, Zelda Lambert. I think I have since that first day when you looked at me like you did not need rescuing but would not say no to a little help. I love you too. The words felt natural, right? Stay with me. Make this your home. Yes, he said simply. Yes to all of it. The door banged open and Samuel rushed in, then stopped short when he saw them standing so close together. A huge grin spread across his face. Does this mean he is staying? Zelda laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Yes, he is staying. Samuel let out a whoop and did a little dance. I knew it. I knew you two would figure it out. Thomas laughed too, reaching out to ruffle the boy's hair. You are pretty smart for a 14-year-old. So, are you going to get married? Samuel asked with the bluntness of youth. Zelda felt her face heat, but Thomas just smiled. If she will have me, I am going to ask her properly. But maybe give us a little time, huh? That time came 2 weeks later. Thomas had ridden into Spokane Falls and returned with a small gold band that he said had belonged to his mother. That evening, he got down on one knee in front of the fireplace and asked Zelda to be his wife. She said yes, before he even finished asking. They were married a month later by the circuit preacher who came through Spokane Falls. It was a small ceremony with just a few neighbors as witnesses, but it was perfect. Zelda wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Thomas had picked for her that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her, Zelda felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This man, this wanderer who had appeared in her field when she needed him most, was now her husband. They were a family now, the three of them, bound together by more than just blood. The first winter was hard in the way that all winters were hard in eastern Washington, but it was also wonderful. Having Thomas there made everything easier and better. He was endlessly capable, fixing things around the farm that had been broken for years, improving systems, making plans for expansion. But more than that, he was a companion, someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to share the load with. He was affectionate in ways Zelda had not expected, always finding excuses to touch her, to pull her close, to steal kisses when Samuel was not looking. At night, in the privacy of their room, he was tender and passionate, and Zelda discovered depths of feeling she had not known she was capable of. By spring, she was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Thomas was thrilled, immediately becoming protective and insisting she not work too hard, which she largely ignored. Samuel was excited to be an uncle. even though Zelda had to explain that the baby would actually be his niece or nephew only in the loosest sense. They planted the fields together that year, all three of them working side by side. Thomas had ideas for rotating crops and letting some fields lie fallow to restore the soil. He had plans for building up their livestock, for maybe getting some dairy cows. He talked about the future like it was something bright and full of possibility, and Zelda found herself believing him. The baby came in late October of 1884, a boy they named Daniel after Thomas's father. He was healthy and loud, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Thomas held his son with a look of such wonder and love that Zelda fell in love with him all over again. Samuel was a devoted uncle, constantly wanting to hold the baby or help with him. The house that had felt so empty after her father's death now felt full and warm and alive. The years that followed were not always easy. Farming never was. There were lean years and good years. Years when the wheat prices dropped and they had to tighten their belts. Years when the harvest was abundant and they could finally get ahead. But they faced it all together, and that made all the difference. Thomas proved to be a natural farmer, taking to the work with the same dedication he had given to everything else in his life. He was also a wonderful father, patient with Daniel and later with their daughter Mary, who was born 2 years after her brother, and their youngest, another boy named James, who came along 3 years after that. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over a portion of the land to farm for himself. He married a girl from town, a sweet-natured woman named Catherine, and they built a house on the far corner of the property. It made Zelda happy to know the land would stay in the family, that her father's legacy would continue. As the years passed, the farm prospered. Thomas's innovations paid off, and they were able to expand their holdings, buying another 100 acres from a neighbor who was moving back east. They built a proper house, bigger than the original cabin, with enough room for their growing family and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over their fields. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas gave Zelda a locket with pictures of their 3 children inside. They sat on that porch, watching Daniel and Mary chase fireflies while baby James slept in Zelda's arms and reflected on how much had changed. "You ever miss it?" Zelda asked. "The wandering, the mountains and the freedom." Thomas pulled her closer, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Not for a second. I did not know what I was wandering toward until I found it, until I found you. This is where I was always meant to be." "I love you," she said, the words as true as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too, more than you will ever know." The children grew and the farm grew with them. Daniel showed an aptitude for mechanics and eventually opened a shop in Spokane Falls, though he kept a hand in the farm too. Mary married a banker's son, much to everyone's surprise, and moved to Seattle. James stayed on the land, loving it the way Zelda and Thomas did, and eventually took over the day-to-day operations as they grew older. In 1903, 20 years after that fateful summer when a mountain man had ridden into her life and changed everything, Zelda and Thomas celebrated their 20th anniversary. Their hair was graying now, their faces marked by years of sun and wind, but they were still strong, still partners in every sense of the word. They threw a party, inviting everyone from miles around. Samuel and Catherine came with their 4 children. Daniel came from town with his wife and 2 boys. Mary made the trip from Seattle with her husband and 3 daughters. James and his new bride, a farmer's daughter from a neighboring property, helped organize everything. As Zelda looked around at the gathering, at the family that had grown from that moment of desperate hope when she had asked a stranger to stay, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Her life had turned out nothing like she had planned, and yet it was more than she ever could have dreamed. That night, after all the guests had left and the grandchildren were sleeping in various rooms throughout the house, Zelda and Thomas sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The wheat fields, now worked by their son and the hired hands they could finally afford, rustled in the evening breeze. "You remember that first day?" Zelda asked, "when you rode up and offered to help?" "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even covered in dust and looking like you wanted to shoot me," she laughed. "I did not want to shoot you. You had your hand on that rifle. Well, a woman alone has to be careful." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am glad you stopped, glad you offered to help, glad you stayed. Me too, best decision I ever made." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "You gave me everything, Zelda. A home, a family, a purpose. A love I did not even know I was looking for." "We gave each other everything," she corrected. "I could not have saved the farm without you, could not have built this life without you. You are my partner in all things." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered, the sounds of the frontier that had been the soundtrack to their lives together. "I want you to know something," Thomas said eventually. "If I had known how my life would turn out, if I could have seen all of this that day I rode up to your farm, I would have ridden faster. I would have found you sooner, because every day with you has been a gift." Zelda felt tears sting her eyes, happy tears. "Every day with you has been an adventure. A good adventure, the very best adventure." He pulled her close and kissed her, and it was still as sweet and right as it had been that first time in her kitchen 20 years ago. Some things, the best things, never changed. As they finally went inside for the night, Thomas paused at the door and looked back at the fields one more time. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think I was wandering all those years because I was looking for this. For you. For home. I just did not know it until I found it." "We found each other," Zelda said, "and we built something beautiful." "We did," he agreed. "We really did." They went inside together, closing the door on the night and on that chapter of their story, but there would be many more chapters to come. Grandchildren would grow up running through those wheat fields. The farm would continue to prosper under James's capable management, and eventually his children would take over. The house would be filled with love and laughter and the everyday sounds of family life. Years later, when they were both old and gray and their children had children of their own, people would still tell the story of how Thomas Walker had ridden down from the mountains and fallen in love with the fierce young woman who refused to give up her farm. How he had helped her bring in the harvest and, in the process, harvested her heart. Zelda and Thomas would sit on their porch and listen to these stories, sometimes correcting details, sometimes just smiling at each other with the secret knowledge of two people who had lived it. They had faced drought and hardship, had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had raised children and buried parents and worked until their bodies ached, but through it all, they had each other. And that, they both knew, was the greatest harvest of all. On a warm summer evening in 1915, 32 years after they first met, Thomas and Zelda sat on their porch surrounded by family. 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren filled the house and yard. The farm that had nearly been lost now sprawled across 400 acres, prosperous and productive, a testament to hard work and determination. Daniel had come from Spokane Falls, now a thriving city, where his mechanical shop had become one of the most successful in the region. He had brought his wife and their 2 sons, both young men now, one of whom was studying engineering at the new state college. Mary had traveled from Seattle with her husband, now a prominent banker, and their 3 daughters. The oldest was engaged to be married, and they were discussing wedding plans that made Zelda's head spin with their complexity and expense. How different from her own simple ceremony. James and his wife lived in the new house they had built on the property, and their 4 children were constant fixtures at the main house, always underfoot but always welcome. The youngest, a boy of 8 named after his grandfather Thomas, was particularly attached to the old couple, always wanting to hear stories of the old days. Samuel, now 56, had lost his beloved Catherine 2 years prior, but his children and grandchildren kept him busy and surrounded by love. He had been Zelda's rock through everything, and she knew how blessed she was to still have her brother. As the evening wore on and the younger children were put to bed, the adults gathered on the porch and in the yard. Someone had brought a guitar, and the old songs were sung, the ones Thomas used to play on his harmonica. He still had that harmonica, though his fingers were too stiff with age to play it much anymore. Young Thomas climbed into his grandfather's lap. "Tell me the story again, Grandpa, about how you met Grandma." Thomas looked at Zelda and she nodded, smiling. They had told this story 100 times, but they never tired of it. "Well," Thomas began, his voice still strong despite his 74 years. "It was the summer of 1883, and I was coming down from the mountains where I had been trapping. I was planning to head to California to see the ocean, but then I saw this woman working in a wheat field." "What did she look like?" the boy asked, though he knew the answer. "She looked like she was fighting the whole world all by herself and refusing to lose. Her face was dirty and she was tired, but she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Zelda laughed. "I looked like a scarecrow." "You looked like strength and courage," Thomas countered, "and I knew right then that I had to help her, so I offered to work for just food and shelter." "And you fell in love," young Thomas said, delighted with the story as always. "I did. We both did. And I stayed and we built all of this together." He gestured at the farm, at the family gathered around them. "Best decision I ever made." "And you never went to California?" the boy asked. "Never needed to. I found something better than any ocean. I found home." Zelda reached over and took her husband's hand, weathered and spotted with age now but still strong, still capable of making her feel safe and loved. They had been married for 32 years, had built a life and a family from nothing but hope and hard work and love. "I love you," she said softly, just for him. "I love you too," he answered. "Always have, always will." As the stars came out and the family began to drift toward their various sleeping arrangements, Zelda and Thomas remained on the porch. It was harder for them to get around these days, took them longer to climb the stairs to their bedroom, so they often sat late into the night, unwilling to end the day. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had kept riding that day?" Zelda asked. "If you had gone to California like you planned." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes, but I think I would have been looking for this my whole life and never finding it. The ocean would have been beautiful, I am sure, but it would not have been home. It would not have been you. We have had a good life. We have had a magnificent life. You gave me everything I did not know I needed, a purpose, a home, a family, love that fills me up and makes everything worthwhile. You saved me," Zelda said. "Saved the farm, saved my life, saved me from a future of being alone and struggling." "We saved each other," Thomas corrected gently. "You gave me a reason to stop wandering, a place to belong. I was lost before I found you, even if I did not know it." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from decades of companionship. The night was peaceful, the air sweet with the scent of wheat and wildflowers. In the distance, they could hear the murmur of their children's voices, the laughter of their grandchildren. No regrets, Zelda asked. Not a single one. You. Only that I did not tell you I loved you sooner. We wasted almost a month dancing around it. Thomas laughed, the sound warm and familiar. We made up for lost time. They certainly had. 32 years of marriage, a lifetime of love and partnership. They had weathered everything together, stood strong against every challenge. The farm that had almost been lost was now a thriving operation that would continue for generations. The love that had bloomed in a wheat field had grown and deepened, producing a family tree with branches spreading wide. Eventually, they made their slow way inside and up to their bedroom. They helped each other prepare for bed as they had done for years, comfortable in their routines and in each other's presence. When they finally lay down, Thomas pulled Zelda close, her head resting on his shoulder as it had for thousands of nights. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what? For asking me to stay, for loving me, for this life. Thank you for stopping that day, for helping with the harvest. For harvesting my heart too." He kissed the top of her head. "Sleep well, my love, sleep well." They drifted off together, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the evidence of their love in every corner of the house, in every acre of land, in every child and grandchild bearing their legacy forward. The years continued to pass. They grew older, more fragile, but their love never wavered. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1923, surrounded by an even larger family. More great-grandchildren had been born, and their first great-great-grandchild was on the way. The world was changing rapidly around them. Automobiles were common now, replacing the horses and wagons of their youth. Electricity had come to Spokane Falls, now just called Spokane, and was slowly spreading to the rural areas. The farm used modern equipment that would have seemed like magic in 1883, but some things remained constant. The wheat still grew golden in the summer sun. The family still gathered for dinners and celebrations. And Thomas and Zelda still sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, grateful for every day they had been given together. Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1924 at the age of 83. Zelda woke to find him gone, and though she grieved, there was also gratitude. They had been given 41 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. Not many people were that blessed. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see her great-great-grandchild born, long enough to know that the farm and the family were secure. She remained sharp and engaged until the end, still dispensing advice and telling stories of the old days. On a summer evening in 1929, sitting on the porch where she had spent so many hours with Thomas, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Zelda Lambert Walker closed her eyes for the last time. She was 88 years old, and she had lived a full and remarkable life. They buried her next to Thomas in the small cemetery on the edge of the property, under an oak tree they had planted together on their first anniversary. The headstones were simple but elegant, bearing their names and dates and a single inscription that James had chosen. Together they harvested more than wheat. The farm continued, passed down through the generations. James's children and then grandchildren worked the land, honoring the legacy that Zelda and Thomas had built. The story of how they met, how a mountain man had stopped to help a desperate young woman and stayed to build a life with her, became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The wheat still grew in those fields, golden and abundant, a living testament to the power of hard work and determination and love. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the light hit just right, people swore they could see two figures sitting on the old porch, holding hands and watching the sunset, together for all eternity, just as they had promised each other so long ago. Their love had started with a harvest, with a stranger's kindness and a woman's desperate hope. It had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that changed not just their lives but the lives of everyone who came after them. They had faced the challenges of frontier life together, had built something from nothing, had created a legacy that would endure in the end. Thomas had been right that first evening when he told Zelda they would get the harvest in. They had harvested the wheat and so much more. They had harvested hope and joy and family and belonging. They had harvested love in its purest, most enduring form, and that harvest, planted in faith and watered with tears and tended with devotion, had yielded a bounty beyond measure. It was a harvest that would never end, continuing to bear fruit generation after generation, a testament to what two people could build when they committed their lives to each other and to something greater than themselves. The story of Zelda and Thomas, of the harvest that saved a farm and kindled a love, lived on. It was told to children and grandchildren, passed down as a reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings come from unexpected places, that sometimes a stranger riding up to your field turns out to be the answer to prayers you did not even know you were praying. Their love story had begun in sweat and desperation, in a wheat field under the harsh Washington sun. But it had bloomed into something beautiful and eternal, a love that transcended time and death, a love that changed everything it touched. And if love could be measured in the lives it touches, the family it creates, the legacy it leaves behind, then Zelda and Thomas had the richest love of all.